There is a specific kind of pain that does not have a clean name in the English language. But every person who has ever prayed with everything they had and heard nothing back knows exactly what it feels like. It is not the pain of tragedy itself, though tragedy is present. It is not the pain of loss, though loss is coming. It is the pain of the gap, the agonizing, faith-shaking gap between the moment you cried out to the God you have been told loves you and the moment when that God, by every visible and measurable evidence available to you, simply did not respond. The silence that follows the most desperate prayer you have ever prayed. The stillness of heaven at the moment when heaven's movement would have changed everything. Mary and Martha knew that pain. They knew it on a specific afternoon in Bethany, a small village about 2 miles east of Jerusalem, when their brother Lazarus was dying. And the one person in the world they believed could help him was nowhere near them. They sent a messenger to find Jesus, and the message they sent tells us everything we need to know about where they stood theologically in that moment. They did not send a theological argument. They did not send a doctrinal petition or a carefully reasoned appeal. They sent 5 words. Lord, the one you love is sick. That is all. That is the entirety of the message. The one you love. As if to say, we are not making a case based on our worthiness or our credentials or the merit of our request. We are making a case based on yours. You said you loved him. Act like it. It is one of the most emotionally honest prayers in the entire New Testament. And it is honest in a way that I think a lot of American Christians have been trained out of being. We have been taught to frame our prayers carefully, to make sure our theology is in order before we approach God, to present our requests with the appropriate spiritual vocabulary and the appropriate degree of faith and the appropriate level of submission to whatever God's answer turns out to be. And all of those things have their place. But Mary and Martha threw all of that out the window because their brother was dying, and they did not have time for careful framing. They had time for 5 words. The one you love is sick. Come. And then the Gospel of John records something that has troubled honest readers for 2,000 years. It records it simply, without softening it, without providing an immediate theological explanation that would make it easier to swallow. Jesus received the message. He heard that Lazarus was sick. He knew where Lazarus was, and he knew how to get there, and he knew, with the knowledge that belongs to the one who is both fully God and fully human, exactly what was happening in that house in Bethany, and exactly what it would mean if he did not go immediately. And then John records these words. When he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. 2 more days, not a 2-day delay caused by unavoidable circumstances. Not 2 days spent traveling in the wrong direction before receiving word. 2 deliberate, chosen, intentional, additional days in the place where he already was. And then, in case the reader has missed the significance of the delay, John frames it with a theological statement that is either the most comforting or the most confusing sentence in this entire account, depending on where you are standing when you read it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. He loved them, and he stayed. He loved them, and he waited. He loved them, and he let the thing they were most afraid of happen while he had the power to prevent it. I want to stay with the discomfort of this for a moment, because I think the way we handle this discomfort or fail to handle it determines whether this story actually does anything in our lives, or whether it simply becomes another piece of ancient religious content that we nod at without ever letting it reach the parts of us that most need it. The discomfort is real. The theological question it raises is real. If God loves you, why does he sometimes stay where he is when you are desperate for him to come? If prayer moves the heart of God, Why do some prayers, sincere, desperate, faith-filled, biblically grounded prayers, seem to bounce off the ceiling and go nowhere? If the God of the universe is sovereign over every situation, why does he allow situations to deteriorate past the point of human repair before he acts? These are not small questions. They are not questions that can be answered with a slogan or a bumper sticker or a tidy three-point sermon illustration. They are the questions that have broken the faith of people who were not given good answers, and they deserve to be taken seriously. And this story, this specific, detailed, historically grounded account of what happened in Bethany when Jesus waited 2 extra days, is one of the most serious and most honest attempts the New Testament makes to address them. Because what John tells us next is the key that unlocks everything else. Jesus, after the 2 days, said to his disciples, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." And when the disciples misunderstood and thought he was talking about natural sleep, he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. For your sake, I am glad I was not there." Not glad that Lazarus died, not indifferent to the grief of Mary and Martha, but glad deliberately, purposefully, for a specific reason that had to do with what the disciples were going to need in order to believe what he needed them to believe. Glad that the situation had deteriorated to the point where what was about to happen could only be explained as God. The delay was not abandonment. The silence was not indifference. The 2 days were not a malfunction of the prayer system or evidence that the love Jesus claimed to have for this family was insufficient to produce action. The delay was a design. It was the careful, deliberate, painful on purpose creation of the conditions under which the thing that needed to happen could happen in the way it needed to happen in order to produce in the people who witnessed it a faith that would be adequate for everything that was coming. Lazarus needed to be 4 days dead, not 3, not 2, 4, because 4 days dead in the theological and cultural context of first century Judaism meant something specific about the finality and the irreversibility of death. And Jesus was going to need that finality to be fully established before he arrived, because what he was about to do required the most impossible version of the situation to make the most undeniable statement about who he was. Sometimes God lets the sickness become death so he can show you a resurrection. Sometimes the delay you're living through right now, the unanswered prayer, the silence that feels like abandonment, the situation that has deteriorated past every point of human hope, is not God's denial of your request. It is God's design for a miracle that required your Lazarus to be 4 days dead before it could unfold. And that is the most uncomfortable and the most important truth that this story is going to take us through in the chapters ahead. When Jesus finally arrived at the outskirts of Bethany, the village was wrapped in the particular heavy atmosphere that settles over a community when one of its own has died, and the mourning has had days to deepen into something that feels permanent. Jewish funeral practices in the first century involved an intense communal, public expression of grief. Professional mourners gathered friends and extended family, the kind of collective outpouring of sorrow that modern American culture, with its tendency toward private and abbreviated grief, would find overwhelming. Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. The community had had 4 days to absorb the loss, to settle into the reality of it, to begin the slow and painful process of reorganizing their understanding of the world around the fact that Lazarus was gone. And 4 days was significant beyond the simple passage of time. The religious tradition of first century Judaism held that the soul of a deceased person hovered near the body for 3 days after death, perhaps hoping for restoration, perhaps simply reluctant to depart from what it had known. But on the fourth day, with the physical deterioration of the body now unmistakable and undeniable, the soul was believed to finally and permanently depart. 4 days did not simply mean a long time. It meant the official, final, culturally ratified declaration that what was dead would stay dead. There was no hope left in 4 days. Not the practical hope of resuscitation, not the theological hope of the soul's return, not any version of any hope that any framework available in that world could construct. 4 days was the end of the story. Martha heard that Jesus was coming, and she went out to meet him. She did not wait at the house. She ran out down the road to meet him, and what she said to him when she reached him is, I believe, one of the most important sentences in this entire account, not because of its theology, which is in some ways a mixture of faith and accusation, but because of its honesty. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Lord, if you had been here, if you had come when we sent for you, if you had not stayed where you were for 2 more days while my brother was dying, if the God who is supposed to love us had acted like it when it mattered most, my brother would not have died. I want to pause here and acknowledge something that I think is deeply important, and that polite religious discourse often prevents us from saying clearly enough. Martha was not wrong to feel what she felt. She was not in a state of spiritual failure when she said those words to Jesus. She was not exhibiting a deficiency of faith that needed to be corrected before she could receive the miracle. She was being honest. She was giving voice to the exact experience that she and her sister had been living through for 4 days. The experience of needing Jesus and not having him there. The experience of watching someone she loved die, while the one person who could have prevented it chose not to come in time. And Jesus did not rebuke her for it. He did not correct her theology before he addressed her grief. He received her where she was, with what she was carrying, and he began to work from there. This matters enormously for the way we understand what it means to bring our honest pain to God. American Christian culture has a complicated relationship with honesty in prayer. We have been taught in various ways and to varying degrees that faith requires a certain positivity, that doubt is the enemy of the miraculous, that expressing the full weight of our grief and our disappointment and our anger at God is somehow spiritually dangerous or indicative of weak faith. We have been shown, often by example more than by explicit instruction, that the appropriate response to suffering is to smile and trust, and not let anyone see the depth of what you are actually feeling. Martha did not do that, and Jesus did not ask her to. What Jesus did instead was to say something to her that I want to spend the rest of this chapter sitting with, because it is the theological center of this entire story, and it is the statement that makes everything else possible. He said, your brother will rise again. And Martha gave him the theologically correct answer that she had been taught. I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. She believed in resurrection. She just did not believe it was available for Lazarus here, now, in the specific, irreversible 4 days dead situation that she was living in. She had placed resurrection in the category of future theological promise and firmly separated it from the category of present, practical reality. And that is exactly the gap that Jesus came to Bethany to close. Not just for Martha, and not just for Lazarus, and not just for the crowd of mourners who would witness what was about to happen. For everyone who has ever looked at a situation that feels 4 days dead, a marriage, a faith, a purpose, a relationship, a dream, and placed resurrection firmly in the category of future theological hope, while refusing to believe it had any application to the specific, irreversible loss they were currently grieving. Jesus came to Bethany to say, in the most undeniable way possible, that the God of future resurrection is the same God who stands before you right now in the specific situation you are in right now, with the specific dead thing you are grieving right now. And he is not done. There are 7 statements in the Gospel of John where Jesus uses the words, I am, followed by a declaration about his own identity. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. And standing outside the tomb of his dead friend with a grieving woman before him and a crowd of mourners behind her, Jesus makes the declaration that is perhaps the most staggering of all of them. I am the resurrection and the life. I want to make sure you feel the full weight of those words, because they are so familiar that they can slide past us without doing what they were designed to do. Jesus did not say, I can produce a resurrection. He did not say, I have access to resurrection power. He did not say, I am able under certain circumstances to raise the dead. He said, I am the resurrection. The resurrection is not a miracle he performs. It is not a power he wields. It is who he is. Life is not something he distributes from an external supply. Life is what he is, at the most fundamental level of his being. To be in his presence is to be in the presence of life itself, because he is life, the same life that was in the beginning, that spoke everything that exists into existence from nothing, that sustains every breath of every creature that has ever lived or will ever live. This distinction is not a theological technicality. It is the most practically important thing about this statement, because it determines what is possible when Jesus shows up at a situation that everyone has agreed is finished. If Jesus were simply a healer or a miracle worker, even a very powerful one, then the question of what he can do in your specific situation would be a question about the limits of his power relative to the severity of your need. How bad is the situation? Can his power address it? Is this within the scope of what he is able to handle? Those would be reasonable questions to ask about a limited being with impressive but finite abilities. But if Jesus is the resurrection, if life itself is what he is rather than what he carries, then the question of limits is the wrong question entirely. The question is not whether the situation is too far gone for his power to address. The question is whether he chooses to address it, because his nature is not constrained by the degree of death it encounters. Death is not his opponent on even terms. Death is not a force that resists or diminishes him. Death is simply the absence of what he is, and the absence of life in the presence of the one who is life is an unstable condition. Then he asked Martha the question that I want to suggest is the most important question in this entire account. Not the most dramatic question, what follows is more dramatic. Not the most miraculous question, the miracle itself is more miraculous. But the most important question, because everything else that happens in this story depends on how Martha answers it. Do you believe this? He asked her. Do you believe this? Not do you understand it, not can you explain it, not does it accord with your current theological framework. Do you believe it? About your brother, about this situation, right now, in this specific, impossibly dead circumstance, with 4 days of evidence against you, and the smell of the tomb in the air. Do you believe that what I just said about myself applies here? And Martha said, yes. Not a confident, fully developed, theologically sophisticated yes. The yes of a woman who was still in the middle of her grief, who had not yet seen anything happen, who had nothing visible to base her answer on, except the identity of the person standing in front of her. She said, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. That was enough. It was not perfect faith. It was not complete faith. But it was honest faith, the faith of a person who has been disappointed and hurt and is still not entirely sure how this is going to unfold, but who chooses, in the face of all the evidence against it, to plant her flag in the identity of the one who has just made the most extraordinary claim in human history. And that is the faith that God works with, not the faith that has all the answers, not the faith that has never wobbled or questioned or cried out into the dark wondering where God is. The faith that knows who Jesus is and chooses to trust that identity even when the circumstances argue against it. The faith that says, yes, Lord, I believe, even when what I believe is standing outside the sealed tomb of what I most desperately needed and have already lost. Mary arrived at the place where Jesus was, and she fell at his feet. She had the same words as her sister. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But she did not say them standing up the way Martha had. She said them on the ground, weeping, with the specific physical posture of a person who has been completely broken by grief and has nothing left to hold herself upright. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and when he saw the crowd of mourners who had come with her weeping, the text records, something that is theologically extraordinary and humanly breathtaking, and which I believe is more important for the American church to sit with right now than almost anything else in this entire story. Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The Greek words here, embrimaomai and tarasso, are not gentle words. They do not describe a mild welling of sympathetic emotion. Embrimaomai carries the meaning of a deep, visceral, almost physical disturbance, an emotional response that comes from the inside, from the very core of the person, in the way that a strong wind disturbs water at a profound depth. And tarasso means to be thrown into agitation, to be stirred up in a way that the external surface of your composure cannot entirely conceal. Jesus was not politely sad. He was shaken deeply, genuinely, all the way down, shaken by what he was seeing and feeling in that moment. And then John records the shortest verse in the entire Bible. In English, it is 2 words. In Greek, it is 2 words. Jesus wept. That is the whole verse. There is no additional context in the sentence itself, no qualifying explanation, no theological note to help the reader process it. Just the bare, simple, unadorned fact. He cried. Now here's what makes this moment so theologically extraordinary, and why I think it deserves more attention than it typically receives in the way this story is taught. Jesus knew what he was about to do. He had already told his disciples that Lazarus' death was for the glory of God. He had already told Martha that Lazarus would rise again. He had already declared himself to be the resurrection and the life. He knew with absolute certainty that within a matter of minutes he was going to call Lazarus out of that tomb, and Lazarus was going to come out. He was not weeping because he was uncertain about the outcome. He was not weeping because he had lost hope. He had not lost anything. He was weeping in the full possession of the knowledge that the very thing everyone around him was mourning was about to be completely and permanently reversed. And he still wept. Let that land. He wept anyway. He wept even though he already knew the answer. He wept even though the miracle was already decided. He wept because the grief in front of him was real, even if its cause was temporary. He wept because the pain of Mary and the pain of the crowd was genuine. Human suffering and genuine human suffering mattered to him, regardless of whether he was about to resolve it. He wept because he is not a God who fast forwards through your pain to the resolution he has already planned. He is a God who sits down in the middle of the pain and weeps with you, even when he knows exactly how the story ends. I want to speak to something here that I think is one of the most damaging cultural forces operating in the lives of American Christians right now. And it is something that the weeping of Jesus stands in direct and permanent opposition to. It is what psychologists call toxic positivity, the cultural insistence that the correct response to every difficult circumstance is an immediate pivot to gratitude and optimism, and the reiteration of whatever truth will make the difficulty seem less severe. The instinct to say, at least, and, but God has a plan, and everything happens for a reason, and just trust the process, in the face of grief before the grief has had any room to be what it actually is. The cultural and sometimes religious pressure to skip straight from pain to perspective, to move as quickly as possible from the broken heart to the lesson. The broken heart was supposed to teach you, without ever fully inhabiting the reality of what the breaking felt like. Jesus did not do that. Jesus stood at the tomb of his friend, a tomb he was about to empty, and he wept. He gave full, public, visible expression to the genuine grief of a genuine moment. And he did so without any apparent concern that this expression of grief was inconsistent with his faith or his power or his certain knowledge of what was about to happen. He modeled for everyone who would ever read this account that grief is not a failure of faith, that tears are not evidence of insufficient trust, that the God who has already secured your miracle is not impatient with your mourning in the time before the miracle arrives. Your grief is valid. Your tears are seen. The God who holds the answer to the thing you are crying about is not standing at a distance, slightly impatient for you to pull yourself together so he can show you the resolution he has been holding all along. He is right there in the middle of it, weeping with you. Not because he does not know the answer, because he loves you enough to enter the pain before he resolves it. They came to the tomb. It was a cave, the text tells us, with a stone laid against the entrance. The stone was there for practical reasons, to seal the space against animals, to mark the location, to provide a visible symbol of the finality of what lay inside. But in the story John is telling, the stone carries a weight of meaning that goes beyond its practical function. It is the physical manifestation of every argument against hope, every piece of evidence for permanence of loss, every human conclusion that what is done, and what is dead will stay dead, and there is no point in pretending otherwise. The stone is the period at the end of the sentence. The stone is the door that has been closed and locked and over which a final accounting has been made. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And Martha, who had just declared her belief that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God, who had just said yes to the question of whether she believed he was the resurrection and the life, Martha immediately objected. "But Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." There is a bad odor. It is one of the most humanly honest responses in the entire gospel narrative. She believed in the resurrection of the last day. She had professed her faith in the identity of the one standing before her. And now, faced with the specific practical reality of rolling away the stone from a 4-day-old tomb, all of that theology ran directly into the reality of decomposition. And the reality of decomposition blinked first. I want to draw your attention to the specific thing Martha was afraid of, because I think it illuminates one of the most common reasons that people block their own miracles without realizing they are doing it. She was not afraid of the act of moving the stone itself. Moving a stone is hard work, but it is not impossible. She was afraid of what would be exposed if the stone was moved. She was afraid of the smell. She was afraid of the visible, undeniable, inescapably obvious evidence of everything that had been happening in that tomb for 4 days. Evidence that would be public, that would be witnessed by everyone present, that would eliminate any possibility of maintaining the dignified closure that 4 days of proper mourning had provided. There are things in our lives that have stones over them for exactly the same reason. Not because we have forgotten about them, not because we are unaware of what lies beneath, but because as long as the stone is in place, the contents are contained. As long as the stone is there, we can maintain the narrative of settled grief, of processed loss, of concluded chapters. The stone is what makes it possible to keep moving forward without fully confronting what is actually behind it. And the stone has an important function. It keeps the smell inside. But here is the uncomfortable truth that this moment in the story of Lazarus confronts us with. You cannot have a resurrection without rolling away the stone. The miracle does not happen through the stone. The life does not emerge through the sealed entrance. The specific, personal, powerful call of Jesus to whatever is dead inside that cave requires the cave to be open, requires the thing that was sealed and contained and concluded to be exposed and accessible and vulnerable to whatever he is about to do. And the exposure feels terrifying, because what comes out first, before the resurrection, before the miracle, before anything else, is the smell. The reality of what decomposition looks like when the sealed door is finally opened. The truth of what has been happening in there, in the dark, while the stone was in place. Jesus said to Martha, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Not if you cleaned everything up first. Not if you made the situation presentable. Not if you managed the exposure so that only the acceptable parts were visible to the watching crowd. If you believed." The belief was the prerequisite. The rolling away of the stone was the obedience that corresponded to the belief. And the glory of God was what followed, but not until the stone was moved. They moved the stone. And the story of what happened next is what everything in this account has been building toward. Jesus looked up. In the middle of the smell and the exposure and the crowd of mourners and the open darkness of the tomb, he looked up. And he prayed not a long prayer, not an elaborate theological petition, but a brief and transparent conversation with his Father, in which he explicitly stated that the prayer was not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of the crowd standing around them, so that they might believe that the Father had sent him. The prayer was a gift to the watching crowd, an invitation to witness not just a miracle, but a relationship, the relationship between the Father and the Son, operating in full, mutual, perfect trust in the most impossible circumstance that the village of Bethany had ever witnessed. And then Jesus cried out with a loud voice. John says that he cried out. The word suggests volume, urgency, authority. This was not the quiet, intimate voice he had used to ask Martha if she believed. This was a command, issued with the full authority of the one who is the resurrection and the life, directed into the darkness of a 4-day-old tomb. "Lazarus, come out!" The theologian Augustine of Hippo, reflecting on this moment in the early 5th century, made an observation that has stayed with readers ever since. If Jesus had not called Lazarus by name, Augustine suggested, every grave in the area would have opened. He was making a theological point about the nature of the authority in that voice, the authority that belongs to the one who spoke the universe into existence, the voice that carries within it the creative energy of the original "let there be" that produced everything that is. When that voice speaks to death, death listens. When that voice calls a name, the person bearing that name has no alternative but to respond. The only reason the entirety of the graveyard did not empty at that moment was because the command was specific. Lazarus, not everyone. Lazarus, and then the silence. The moment between the command and the response, a moment that must have stretched in the consciousness of everyone present, far beyond its actual duration. The crowd watching the dark opening of the tomb. The disciples standing near Jesus. Mary and Martha somewhere in the press of mourners, probably unable to breathe. And in the darkness of the tomb, in the silence after the command, in the space. where either the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened in Bethany was about to happen, or the most profound humiliation of a moment of completely misplaced public confidence was about to occur. A sound, movement, the shuffling sound of something wrapped in grave clothes, attempting to navigate an unfamiliar transition. And then, in the opening of the tomb, against the darkness of the interior and the brightness of the Judean afternoon, a figure, still wrapped, still bound, the face still covered with the burial cloth that Jewish tradition required, but moving, coming forward into the light, walking out of the place that everything in the universe of human experience said he had gone into and would not leave. The dead man came out, 4 days dead, in the presence of a crowd of witnesses. In a village 2 miles from Jerusalem, where the religious establishment had been looking for a reason to arrest Jesus for months, in circumstances so specific and so public and so undeniable that no alternative explanation was available to anyone who witnessed it, Lazarus walked out of his own tomb, and the only explanation for what was happening was the one that Jesus had given Martha before any of it began. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus said to the crowd, "Unbind him and let him go." Lazarus had come back to life, but he was still wrapped in the material of death. He was alive, but he was still bound. He had been raised, but he had not yet been freed. And the final act of this miracle required the participation of the community, the unwrapping, the release, the removal of the grave clothes from a man who was alive but needed help to walk fully into that aliveness. Because God does not just resurrect in isolation. He resurrects within community. And the community has a role to play in the process of the resurrection, becoming fully real in the life of the person it has happened to. I want to bring this story all the way into the present moment now, because everything we have covered in the previous 6 chapters has been building toward this application, and I want to make sure it lands with the full weight it deserves. Because this story is not primarily a historical account of something extraordinary that happened to one family in one village in first century Judea. It is a mirror, and the thing it shows in the mirror is not ancient. It is whatever you are carrying right now that feels 4 days dead. Maybe you know exactly what I am talking about. Maybe there is something in your life that you have already mourned. Something you went through the grief process over, something you stood at the tomb of and said goodbye to and slowly, painfully accepted as gone. A marriage that ended, not just struggled, but ended. Papers signed, apartment found, the life you thought you were building, dismantled and distributed between 2 separate addresses. That feels 4 days dead. There is no reasonable human argument left for why hope is appropriate there. The stone is in place. The mourning is in its 4th day. Maybe it is a relationship with a child or a parent or a sibling that has been so thoroughly broken by years of accumulated hurt and miscommunication and deliberate damage that both parties have arrived at the same silent conclusion: this is not a relationship that gets repaired. This is a relationship that ended. Maybe there were genuine attempts to fix it, and the attempts failed. Maybe the failure of the attempts confirmed what everyone privately suspected, that this one is past the point of resurrection. The tomb is sealed, 4 days dead. Maybe it is your faith itself. Maybe you are watching this as someone who grew up believing, who invested in the reality of God with genuine sincerity and genuine effort, who prayed the prayers and lived the life and tried to hold on through the hard seasons, and who arrived somewhere in the accumulation of unanswered prayers and unexplained suffering, and the grinding weight of a world that does not appear to operate the way faith said it would, at the place where belief itself died. Not dramatically, not in a crisis moment, just gradually the way water recedes in a drought, less and less, until one day you look down and there is nothing there. 4 days dead. I want to tell you something about Jesus and 4-day-old tombs that I believe is one of the most important things this story communicates. He is not deterred by them, not slowed by them, not limited by them, not standing outside the sealed entrance calculating whether the degree of death inside is within the operational parameters of his power. When Jesus arrived at the tomb of Lazarus, he did not assess the situation and revise his expectations downward based on how long Lazarus had been dead. He did not look at the stone and the smell and the 4 days and arrive at the conclusion that perhaps this one was beyond what he could do. He arrived at a 4-day-old tomb, and he rolled away the stone, and he called the dead man by name, and the dead man walked out. What God does not do, what this story makes permanently and irrevocably clear, that God does not do, is consult the human timeline for what counts as too late. He is never on time by your schedule. He was not on time by Martha's schedule. He was not on time by Mary's schedule. He was not on time by any human clock that was ticking in Bethany that week. He arrived after Lazarus was dead. He arrived after the morning had begun. He arrived after the theological arguments for resurrection had been thoroughly defeated by the physical reality of a 4-day-old sealed tomb. He arrived exactly when he intended to arrive, which was at the point where what he was about to do would be unmistakable, undeniable, and permanently recorded as the act of the God who is not bound by the human definitions of too late. Your 4-day-old tomb is not a problem for Jesus. The smell coming through the stone is not putting him off. The finality of what the human community around you has concluded about your situation does not constitute the final word on your situation. He is walking toward your Bethany right now. And when he gets there, he is going to do what he has always done in the presence of death. He is going to call the thing that is dead by name, and the thing that is dead is going to walk out. I want to ask you to do something before this chapter ends. Not a dramatic thing, not a complicated thing, not something that requires special training or a particular level of spiritual development, or any degree of having your life together that you do not currently possess. I want to ask you to identify the stone. You know what I mean by the stone. It is the thing you have placed over the dead thing, the sealed entrance, the contained situation, the closed chapter that you have arranged your life around. Not reopening, because the cost of reopening it is the exposure of everything that has been happening inside it since the last time it was open. You know where it is. You have been carefully not looking directly at it for however long it has been there. It sits in your peripheral vision and you orient your daily life around, not bumping into it, around keeping enough distance between yourself and the thing it seals to maintain the functional equilibrium of your existence. And Jesus is standing in front of it right now, saying the same thing he said to the people gathered at the tomb of Lazarus in Bethany. Take away the stone, not tomorrow, not when the circumstances are more favorable or the emotional timing is better, or you feel more spiritually prepared for what might be on the other side. Now, today, take away the stone. I want to be honest with you about what comes when the stone is taken away, because I think dishonesty about this is one of the ways the church has failed people who were genuinely trying to pursue their own resurrections. What comes when the stone is removed is not immediately beautiful. What comes first is the smell. It is the reality of everything that has been sealed inside the grief that was never fully processed, the hurt that was packed carefully away. Instead of healed, the sin or the failure or the damage that the stone was placed over, so that its visible presence would not continue to disturb the managed surface of your daily life. It is the accumulated decomposition of something that has been sealed in the dark. And it will not smell like resurrection at first. It will smell like exactly what it is. And Jesus says, roll it away anyway, because on the other side of the smell is the miracle. On the other side of the exposure is the resurrection. The grave clothes have to come off before the man can walk freely. And the grave clothes come off only after the man walks out. And the man walks out only after the stone is moved. The sequence cannot be reversed. The miracle does not happen through the sealed stone. It happens through the open entrance, in the full presence of whatever is exposed in the moment. When Jesus stands before the most impossible version of your situation and calls the dead thing by name. I want to close by telling you what the name is that he is calling. It is your name, not a category, not the marriage or the faith or the dream, your name. The name you were known by before whatever died in your life defined how you understood yourself. The name that belongs to you as a person made in the image of God, loved by the one who stood outside the tomb of Lazarus and wept before he raised him, loved before the miracle, not just after it. He is calling your name into whatever darkness has been sealed in your life, and he is calling it with the same voice that spoke Lazarus out of 4 days of death. The same authority, the same love, the same absolute certainty of outcome. Your job is the stone. Roll it away. Whatever the stone is, the unforgiveness that has sealed the dead relationship, the pride that has sealed the dead faith, the fear that has sealed the dead dream, the shame that has sealed the dead part of you that still needs to be healed. Roll it away. Not because you are strong enough to do it alone, but because he told you to. And because the miracle that follows the rolling away is worth every bit of the exposure that comes with it. Martha rolled it away, afraid of the smell. And what came out of that darkness was her brother, alive. You can roll it away afraid too. The fear does not disqualify the obedience. The obedience is what matters. Resurrection is his specialty. It has always been his specialty. From the first morning of creation to the morning of his own empty tomb, to every morning since then, when something that was dead has been called back to life by the voice that owns life itself. Resurrection is what he does, and he does it in exactly the circumstances that look most irreversible, most beyond repair, most thoroughly sealed behind the most permanent-looking stones. He does it 4 days in. He does it in Bethany. He does it in your life. He does it today. Roll away your stone. He is already standing at the tomb.